Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Welcome back to On the Ballot. I'm Jeff Pelley, Editor-in-Chief. We're going to talk about Michigan today. We're back with our historical ballot measure series. I love talking with Ryan Byrne, Managing Editor of Ballot Measures, all about the incredibly interesting history of ballot measures in the United States. So today we're going to talk about Michigan, which has 140 years of direct democracy. Really interesting history, too. There's just a ton of fascinating topics have been on the ballot. Ryan will go much more to depth about it. Some of my favorite interesting facts that when I was looking through our report, the state has rejected the income tax 6 different times over a 50-year period. There have been a number of interesting initiatives in the last few years, which we'll talk about momentarily. So yeah, we're going to get right into Michigan. We've talked about 5 other states so far. We're now on our 6th. If you've missed North Carolina, Oregon, California, Ohio, or Wisconsin, you can find those in our podcast archive on Ballotpedia. So Ryan, welcome back. Thanks for coming on. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're in the thick of the heat of summer. And before we talk about the history of Michigan, let's just get briefly caught up on the ongoing climate, because Michigan's a really interesting ballot measure battleground, presidential battleground. It's also an interesting ballot measure battleground. And there are a number of neat ones coming up potentially on the ballot in 2026. And there was an interesting occurrence in 24. So what's been the recent dynamic in Michigan?
Yeah, so recently, I think if you were actually to ask a question about what are the most interesting ballot measures in Michigan's history, and we'll get into those, but a lot of them almost seem somewhat recent. Later, we'll dive into the history stuff. And part of that is just due to these really strong conflicts between what was a Republican trifecta and a number of progressive groups. And we saw lots of big changes, proposals in Michigan, some of which were approved marijuana, first state in the Midwest to legalize marijuana, recent abortion initiative, redistricting, multiple voting policy changes. And then we saw Democrats gain a trifecta for a couple years. And what actually happened then is in 2024, we saw no ballot initiatives. Yeah. That was pretty significant. And part of that may have been due to just the ground game of all those progressive organizations, especially since they have connections across the country. And now if Democrats are in charge, they're going to probably push initiatives less in that state. We didn't necessarily see conservatives pick up the initiative that time, but now we're looking at 2026. We got a divided government, and we got some fascinating ones from both angles. So on one side, we have a number of ballot initiatives related to citizenship and providing information on one's citizenship in order to register, or preempting local governments from allowing non-citizens to vote. And then you also got things like a millionaire's tax to provide additional funding to public school, and ranked choice voting. And one that's actually on the ballot already, which is not a ballot initiative, but an automatic question kind of dictated by the state constitution, is a constitutional convention question. And while those usually go down, I mean, obviously they've been improved in history because we have had new state constitutions, and this is often the starting point. Something really fascinating about this one is the Republican Speaker of the House has endorsed it. So we are seeing some people line up behind rewriting the Michigan Constitution.
Yeah, those con questions, as we call them, don't have a very high success rate in recent cycles. So, and yeah, very, very intriguing that there were no initiatives in 2024. That hadn't really clicked, but it makes sense, because typically what happens is if one party controls government, they don't really make much use of the initiative because they can get their legislative agenda accomplished, or at least try to get it accomplished through the legislature. So let's talk history, though, because that's why we're here. The history of ballot measures in Michigan, 140 years. So what stands out to you when we finished this report, we published it on Ballotpedia, you read it over for one final time? What really stood out?
Yeah, so looking at the broad overview of all those decades, well, what stands out about the numbers specifically is that Michigan looks pretty average. It's not the most exciting fact, but I think part of that is, and we'll get into this a little bit more of the initiative process, but It has a unique history with the initiative. It was the 8th state to adopt the initiative, but it was, like I was mentioning with marijuana earlier, it was the first state in the Midwest. So Michigan's often at the forefront of the Midwest with ballot initiatives. And really, it was the first state east of the Mississippi River to establish the initiative and referendum. And now, when I say it's average, what I mean is the number of initiated measures has fluctuated over time, following pretty typical patterns across a lot of states, increasing in the early 20th century, declining in mid-century, then rising again in the 70s and 80s before stabilizing, possibly declining. We'll see. We'll have to see how the 2020s go in recent years. And now the origin story with the initiative is pretty interesting. It began as a fairly complex system following a constitutional convention. It was actually the legislature that later proposed kind of loosening it up a bit.
Well, it is next door neighbors with Wisconsin, which does not have the initiative, which had defeated the initiative through its own ballot measure process. So, the fact that it did make it across the line in Michigan, it's a pretty telling history piece. So, talk a little more about what really did change to make the process different. You kind of just alluded to that a little bit, but can you say a little more about how did that change? Because not every state has gone through significant changes to its initiative process over time. So, what changed?
Definitely. Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of pre and post. So, starting right, 1908 is when they approved it. It was actually part of the state's new constitution of 1908, talking about constitutional convention questions. Voters needed to approve that first in 1906 to get to that point. And there were groups pushing for the initiative for over a decade. There was a group called the Michigan Direct Legislation Club. Several progressive Republican governors supported it. Legislature, not so much, but they agreed to put that convention question on the ballot. It wasn't an automatic one. They put it on the ballot and voters approved it. Now, talking about the initiative process in that original constitution, it was pretty complex, especially with petition circulation and signatures. So to qualify, signatures had to equal 20% of the votes cast in the last election. That's pretty high, especially back in the early 1900s. Transportation wasn't necessarily as easy and things like that. So even by comparison, looking at today's states, Arizona and Oklahoma have the highest for initiated amendments, and that's 15%, so still below 20. And what's really fascinating is that the language stipulated they could only collect signatures at official election sites under direct supervision. So you couldn't go out there and collect signatures. People had to come to you at specific locations. So if 20%,
what does direct supervision mean? Who's
election
supervising?
officials had to verify that each signature was from a registered voter at the point of signing. I mean, they still do that, right? But they do it after the fact. Where they compare signatures to things on the books and look for any discrepancies. Other states have various requirements, but that's generally how it works. Also, back then they were all indirect, but not in the way we think of indirect initiatives today. So under the original 1908 Constitution, the legislature could approve or reject an initiative, just like it can today. But if it was rejected, it didn't go to voters. It was like a pre-election veto. It just died. That was the end of it. Today, every state with the indirect initiative, if the legislature rejects it, it goes to the ballot for voters to decide. In other words, they can only approve it into law. They can't reject it out of existence as a ballot. Yeah. So then what changed? What changed? So it only took a couple years, but coming out of the convention, supporters, including politicians, there were a number of politicians who kind of were allied with supporters of the process. They recognized that, we're not really going to get anything out of this. So in 1913, the legislature proposed a revision just a couple years later, decreasing the signatures from 20 to 10%, allowed signatures to be collected beyond these designated locations, and eliminated the pre-election veto from the legislature. And this received close to 60% of the vote. In 1914, just a year later, you got your first initiative in Michigan regarding fraternal beneficiary societies. I won't go into that. It's kind of an interesting thing, though, kind of like a proto-insurance type thing. And then, as you said, there was a really big major change early on, but it hasn't really changed much since. So in 1941, voters approved a set of amendments that opponents would argue kind of weaken the process. But these were things like verifying signatures, establishing penalties for offenses, stuff like that. And really, since 1941, there have been some statutory changes, there's been no major changes to the constitutional provision governing the initiative. And this is actually quite fascinating. It's pretty detailed in Michigan. So a lot of constitutions will say, they'll provide a paragraph, right to initiative, but then the legislature kind of defines the rest with implementing legislation. It's pretty detailed in Michigan, which means there's less flexibility for lawmakers to make at least major changes through statute compared to other states. So it would require another constitutional amendment. So yeah, we haven't really seen any major changes to the process since 1941.
Yeah. Okay. Pretty interesting background. So let's talk about some of the topics that have been in the ballot. Michigan voters have had a number of issues come up multiple times. And we've seen this in other states where, an issue comes up, voters say no. Okay, supporters come back around again at a future election cycle. So Michigan voters said no to the income tax 6 different times between 1922 and 1976. They said no to women's suffrage 3 times before 1918. So it's pretty typical for big issues to go in front of voters a few times before something becomes law, right?
Yeah, I would say, I think if someone just looks at one state like Michigan, you're like, whoa, this is quite strange. But it's actually this kind of repetition is not unusual in our historical reviews, especially in like the early mid 1900s. It's become less typical over time. Um, More typical with legislative referrals. So like women's suffrage was a legislative referral, I
Mhm.
believe, each time. The income tax proposal, though, kept coming up, and it was mostly citizen initiated measures, not legislative referrals, though there were a few.
Yeah.
One reason this happens less now, as people can imagine, is right, is just more expensive for a number of reasons to than it was 50 or 100 years ago to keep putting the same issue on the ballot. When we do see it, it's either because donors really believe they can pass it this time, or there's some other reason why, it keeps getting funded. One of our favorite ones to always point out are these conflicts over dialysis in California that seem to come up year after year. But that's because there's some big funders behind it. But yeah, so like I said, it usually requires significant resources to make it happen. Maybe 50 or 100 years ago, not so much. So you could push things popular, at least popular enough, maybe not popular enough to get passed, popular enough to draw a good volunteer base from it to keep putting it on the
Yeah.
ballot over and over.
So what are some of the measures that have had the biggest impact on how Michigan operates as a state today?
Yeah, so like some big structural measures. Well, the easy answer would be the Michigan Constitution of 1963, the state's current constitution, which was narrowly approved by just 7,000 votes out of 1.6 million cast. But, talking about a constitution, that's kind of a package deal. Let's zoom in on a couple specific ballot
And that's a
measures.
full constitution. Like, are voters reading the entire constitution or seeing that on the
Are
ballot,
voters
or are they
reading the
seeing a
entire
summary of it?
constitution? That is a good. I mean, what ends up on the ballot is a summary. And that's a
Yeah.
voter to see. That's what they would see today. And Ballotpedia, we do summarize all the provisions. Though, granted, as we were talking about earlier, people haven't really voted on a whole new state constitution in quite some time. But yeah, thinking
That's
about like
another
these.
episode for another day about the history of state constitutional changes.
Yeah, it would be a fun one. For sure. There's definitely some fun historical conventions. But yeah, in terms of like individual measures, I think the ones that really stand out to me are like these big structural changes with like tax and revenue. I'll talk about two: one citizen initiated, one legislatively referred. So the first one was citizen initiated, Proposal E in 1978. This was known as the Headley Amendment, named after campaign leader Richard Headley. This was a citizen initiated measure. Like I said, it was passed during what was kind of called this tax revolt era. It was actually just a few months after California passed kind of its famous Proposition 13. And Proposal E limited state taxes. But one of the biggest changes was requiring voter approval for local tax increases and prohibiting the state from imposing unfunded mandates on local governments.
Right.
The other one, Proposal A in 1994, was proposed by the legislature, and this actually raised the sales tax by 2 percentage points, but put more limits on local school district taxes. And this caused a big shift in tax revenue in the state for public education. It went from something that was predominantly funded by school district levies, local taxes, to something that was primarily funded by these state taxes. I think even today the state is responsible for about 60% of the funding in Michigan. I live in Pennsylvania, so it's like the opposite. So everyone's always talking about school district taxes.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a big shift. had a big effect on taxes and school revenue, and really affects the state today in terms of how that works.
Yeah, revenue and how things are funded. People, I think, do forget. You're right that it is different in every state and every locality, even. So, um, well, let's talk about margin of victory then. Um, when we do a really big study like this and we get all the data together, then we can see which ones were closest and which ones were the biggest blowouts. So, what were some of the measures that stood out in terms of having the narrowest or widest margins of victory?
Yeah. So narrows is always fun. You're always gonna find something fun there. The widest, often it's something more technical in nature that had like full legislative approval and stuff like that. And that will be the case here, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. So in Michigan, the closest one, this is a fun one, daylight savings time. So proposal 2 of
Yep.
1968. It would have exempted the state from reserving daylight savings time. It was narrowly rejected by just 490 votes out of 2.8 million. So incredibly close to opting out of daylight savings time. So Michiganders, is it
So it would have
Michigan?
been like
Right.
Arizona then, right?
Yep.
Which Arizona has opted out. Is that what
Yeah.
the best comp?
Yeah, exactly. Arizona has opted out. I believe Hawaii has as well, but Hawaii was out there in the Pacific,
Yeah.
closer to the equator. But yeah, so Michigan, very close. Closest ballot measure in state history. Now, the opposite, the widest margin is perhaps less interesting. It was all the way back in 1881. More than 90% of voters approved an amendment allowing the state Supreme Court to appoint its own clerk because the Constitution apparently did not allow them to do that. Now, something a little more interesting, a little closer to modern times, of those top five, one was rather recent. Nearly 90% approved the constitutional amendment in 2020 to require a search warrant to access a person's electronic data and electronic communications. So, anything with electronic data is something that, people have obviously expressed a lot of concern about, and 90% of the polls kind of confirm that.
Yeah. Daylight savings time. That's one of those topics that people love to talk about.
Yeah, it's
Parents of
with
young
ballot measures for
kids or
sure too. Lots of
yeah.
good history there.
There's another one, another episode for another day, Ryan. So, let's end it with a little lightning round on some sort of lighter, more interesting ones that stood out to you. So, fire away.
Yeah, so I guess it depends how you define lighter. I'm gonna take a look at some interesting ones from earlier decades. I'll do it in reverse chronological order, so we'll go back
Okay.
in time as it gets funnier, perhaps. 1970. I mean, this is a big topic even now today. School choice, right? So in
Okay.
1970, voters in Michigan approved Proposal C, which was a constitutional amendment that prohibits the use of public funds for non-public schools, including specifically voucher programs. This is pretty unusual. So Michigan is the only state with a constitutional provision that explicitly bans this type of school choice policy. There are other states that have provisions limiting public funding for non-public education. Most of these were adopted in the late 1800s, early 1900s, so known as Blaine amendments. That was
Yep.
long before the term voucher was even used. These kind of modern iterations of school choice policy. So Michigan, again, the only state with something like that. So to actually enact a voucher program, they would need a constitutional amendment, and that did come up in 1978, and then again in 2000. And both times voters did reject them. Second, in 1950, so later topic. Let's talk about communism a little bit. So voters approved Proposal 3, which was actually aimed at kind of allowing the legislature to implement statutes aimed at subversisaries, specifically in an attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. This constitutional amendment was approved. It was a product of a conflict between the legislature, which wanted to take a more hardline approach, and the governor kind of took more of a moderate approach of not doing things like that. But after the amendment was approved, this conflict between the legislature and the governor and between amongst legislators themselves kind of continued. So no implementing legislation was actually ever passed.
Huh.
So, you hear something like this, you might think the courts might get involved. That never was the case because it was never really enforced. And I do believe the amendment's not in the books anymore. It looks like it was ultimately just repealed 13 years later with a new state constitution in 1963. So kind of a short life,
Yeah.
but kind of represents that Cold War era conflict. And then one more going back to the 1930s. This is a really fun one as well. Maybe another podcast episode. And we recently did a write-up on this if people want to read it on Ballotpedia about in Oregon, but conflicts over oleomargarine, also just known as margarine. Was on the ballot twice in Michigan.
Those
In
Midwestern
1930
farms.
Yeah, in 1932, the legislature passed a bill to prevent, in quotes, deception in the manufacture, serving, and sale of margarine. A veto referendum was filed. Voters, I guess, wanted their margarine or didn't like the regulations, and they overturned it. And then in 1950, they did another veto referendum. The legislature actually attempted to prohibit the sale of margarine, but voters overturned that. And these ballot measures over margarine were really widespread during this period, reflecting this really fascinating conflict over food regulation, which I think, you have parallels in the modern debates. This one didn't result in any ballot measures, but I remember hearing some debates over like what can be labeled milk and so-called nut
Yep.
milks. Everyone likes their oat milk and things like that, whether that legally can be called a milk. No one, like these margarine conflicts, attempted to ban it. It was just a debate over the word choice, but similar thing with this margarine versus butter issue.
It makes you wonder if, some of the like red dye 40 type stuff, and, there's the whole health movement today that is concerned with what ingredients are in cereal and processed foods. If they would ever look to the margarine butter battles of years past, I wonder if we'll see some ballot measures about that
Yeah,
in
I
the
think
future.
ballot initiatives are probably ripe for those types of conflicts. It's just a matter of groups and donors and all that to fund them. So
Yeah.
fascinating stuff. We have seen like GMO labeling stuff before and all that.
California back
conflicts.
in the earlier part of the 21st century. Yeah, I remember those. All right, Ryan. Well, great to see you. Thanks for the history lesson into Michigan's ballot measures. For our listeners, you can learn more about Michigan's ballot measure history and other episodes in our series at the links in our show notes. We'll be back very soon with another episode of On the Ballot, and we'll be back next month with another ballot measure history lesson. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for listening. See you later, Ryan.
Thanks, Jeff. Bye.